This program models PTSD as a combination of three different issues. First, our brains create triggers to react quickly when we recognize a threat from a past experience. When triggers fire, our survival brain takes control only when we perceive our current environment presents a threat that we recognize from our past. Now, over time, healthy brains will retire these triggers as they figure out that when a current environment is safe, then triggers can be retired. Now, the problem is that injured brains really can't figure out when it's okay to retire triggers. So we're going to explain more about that later. Let's define a brain injury as any event that interferes with blood flow to any part of the brain and makes it go dormant. Now, these injuries result from impacts or chemicals or anything that tends to disable the brain's vascular system. So these areas go dormant to survive, and they'll remain dormant as long as it takes to restore the blood flow. Now, the important thing about the word dormant is the brain tissue will stop working because it can't make the energy to do work or to do thinking or processing that it needs without oxygen. And once it goes dormant, it will stay dormant until the very specific conditions that turn it back on can occur. So, in the modern lifestyle and in the context of the modern healthcare system, this is usually never. Now, soldiering, we all know, is dangerous business. Soldiers get brain injuries from impacts, explosions, chemical exposures, and all while they're doing their job, these injuries silently and often permanently shut down parts of their brains. Soldiers live in a dangerous environment, so part of their ability to survive is the ability to create triggers and adapt to the dangerous environment. So the combination of brain injury and these triggers are the hidden recipe for PTSD. Next, let's divide the brain into two parts. Let's think about our thinking brain and our survival brain. Our thinking brain thinks, figures, and manages our social behavior. It's our emotions. It's our social context. This part enables us to be emotional, compassionate, and aware humans. The thinking brain does just about everything except manage our behavior in dangerous or emergency conditions. Now, our survival brain does survival. When it engages, we perceive threat, we flee, or we decide to fight. Now, if we back up a level and think about the physical structure of the brain, the survival brain is wrapped inside the thinking brain. So structurally, it's a cushion. Both the survival brain and the thinking brain, the skull, the thinking brain, and the survival brain, work like a walnut, with the skull being the shell, the thinking brain being I'll call it the padding, and the survival brain, being at the very core. And if you think about it, this structure makes sense because, after all, we can afford to stop thinking for a while, but if we stop surviving, then thinking doesn't matter anymore. The structure makes the thinking part of our brain more vulnerable to injury. It's a cushion that's easily bruised. It has a fragile blood supply. It's easily damaged by chemicals. While it wraps and cushions the survival brain, any sort of head impact can basically bruise it as it squishes against the skull. That's important because when any part of the thinking brain is damaged, it goes dormant. And when this happens, whatever the thinking brain does, it just pauses. It's not dead, it's still there, we can still use it later, but we have to bring it back online first. So what happens then is that whenever part of the thinking brain pauses, it pushes, or more processing gets pushed off to the survival brain. And when this happens, the reliance on the survival brain biases our behavior, perceptions, and reactions in social circumstances, just because that's the only way the brain can work. Because when we need a part of the thinking brain that's offline, it's just not there. We have to cope. So we rely on the survival brain. This brings us to a new definition of PTSD. In our view, PTSD is the survival brain pretty much stuck doing the thinking brain's job. So for someone with PTSD, life feels like, or amounts to, the thinking brain resisting messages from our survival brain to flee, fight, evade, be anxious, while the person that's watching this or feeling this knows that whatever's going on isn't normal. It all happens when our thinking brain is forced to take back seat to our survival brain because our body or our brain can't switch back to putting our thinking brain in the front seat. A little while ago we introduced the concept of a trigger. And triggers are important because the absence of triggers is what we would recognize as safety. But safety, or the recognition of safety, is something that our thinking brain knows how to do. Depending on how injured our thinking brain is, basically injured brains are poor at retiring triggers because they can't do the advanced processing, emotional, memory, etc., that they need to do to perceive safety, because if it's injured enough, those parts that need to be working to recognize safety may be offline. If we assume the perception of safety requires emotional, cognitive, memory, and sensory integration, then how can an injured brain perceive safety? And if an injured brain can never perceive safety, then it can never disable or turn off a trigger. So the person is kind of stuck with this list of triggers, or library of triggers, that drive anxiety or defensive or survival responses in normal social circumstances. So that's why people with PTSD, act strange or feel strange all the time, is because they're just stuck responding to survival when the circumstances or the environment don't require it. Our recovery model addresses this hidden relationship between these brain injuries and dormant areas of the brain and the triggers. So we're assuming that the triggers won't and can't turn off until the higher brain is turned on. We assert that brain oxygenation is a prerequisite for PTSD recovery, because all the parts of the brain that need to participate in a perception and acceptance of safety have to be working before we can turn off a trigger. So our program is a really simple cycle. First, we turn on the higher brain by oxygenating it, and then we go into a cycle of therapy that retires the triggers or turns them off. And then we do both of those over and over again until the person's recovered. What happens over time, usually a few days, is that each iteration of the cycle retires some triggers that decrease the number of social situations which tend to activate the primitive brain. So the whole process ends up putting the thinking brain back in the driver's seat and letting the, I'll call it survival brain, back down and just not be as active. Now, it's a really natural question to say, how long is all this going to take? It sounds really complicated. But what we found is it doesn't take very long at all. We've seen people recover very quickly within 2-3 days. The question is how many iterations or how many laps to the cycle, And what we found is that that kind of depends on a handful of factors. Number one is the level of physical conditioning in the body that enables the body to establish and squirt enough blood through the brain to reactivate it. What kind of shape you're in matters a lot. If you're in good shape, you can move fast. The second one is how fast and effective is the trigger release process. We work with a couple of different techniques, both of which work almost immediately, within minutes. So that usually lets us get through and retire one or more triggers, in an hour or so. We can go through the triggers pretty quick just after we get the parts of the brain working that enable the brain to perceive safety. And then the third part is, how long have the triggers been there? So not necessarily how long, but how many of them are there? So how many situations, really kind of determines how many times you need to go through the cycle releasing the triggers. And the fourth, which is kind of interesting, is the duration of the unhealthy lifestyle that the person had with PTSD, because the longer you spend miserable, the worse you allow your body to degenerate, the harder it is to establish the conditions that switch the brain back on. Now, most people with PTSD eventually end up using street drugs or prescription drugs to, control their discomfort and anxiety. And over time, they become physically addicted to these drugs. Now, when they finish this program, they don't have the discomfort that drives them into needing to use the drugs to feel better. They usually end up saying, well, I don't need the following list of drugs anymore because the reason why I needed them is gone. So, the next normal step after people finish this program is to get support stopping or discontinuing the drugs they become dependent upon.